Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a really fascinating book today, The Guns of August by Barbara W. Tuchman.
Oh, an excellent choice.
It's not just some dry history book, you know. It really digs deep into what caused World War I, the decisions, the events, everything that led up to that global conflict.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize how much those early decisions really mattered. The book shows how those seemingly small things, they just snowballed.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure. Even President Kennedy gave this book as a gift to world leaders.
I can see why. It's incredibly relevant even today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with a book like this?
Well, Tuchman starts way back, actually. She takes us to the Franco-Prussian War and the Battle of Sedan.
That was in the 1870s, right?
Yep, 1870. And that was a crushing defeat for France, like totally demoralizing.
But a huge win for Germany.
Right. And that victory really fueled a dangerous sense of destiny for Germany. You know, like they were on top of the world.
Okay, so they won a big war. They're feeling powerful. How does that lead to another war, like 40 years later?
Because it also left France deeply scarred, obviously. They were humiliated and they were itching for revenge. So it created this really volatile situation in Europe.
A ticking time bomb, almost.
Exactly. And then you factor in the cult of the offensive.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. Tuchman makes that term really come alive.
Right. It was this widespread belief at the time that any future war would be won by whoever struck first and hardest.
Like attack, attack, attack. Don't even think about defending.
That's pretty much it. It wasn't just a strategy. It was a whole mindset that gripped Europe's military leaders.
It seems so reckless looking back on it.
Oh, it definitely was. It led to some seriously flawed plans, like France's Plan 17 and Germany's Schlieffen Plan. Both of them were all about quick, decisive victories.
But as we know, it didn't exactly work out that way.
Nope, not at all. Those plans were based on outdated thinking and completely ignored the realities of modern warfare.
It's kind of amazing how those plans designed to avoid a long war actually helped create the conditions for a long and bloody stalemate.
And that's just part of it. You can't forget about the tangled web of alliances that existed in Europe at the time.
Ah, yes. The alliances. It's almost dizzying trying to keep track of who is allied with whom.
Right. It's like one giant domino effect. One regional conflict triggers all these obligations, and suddenly everyone is getting dragged into the war.
And then you have those larger-than-life personalities, right? Like Kaiser Wilhelm II. He's such a fascinating character in Tuchman's book.
Oh, he's a key player, that's for sure. Ambitious, volatile, deeply insecure.
And obsessed with his British cousin, King Edward VII.
Totally. Wilhelm saw King Edward and British diplomacy as a threat, like they were out to get him.
He was pretty paranoid, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Tuchman shares this crazy anecdote where Wilhelm, convinced that King Edward is plotting against him, scribbles lies all over a diplomatic report.
It's like something out of a movie.
Right. And it shows just how much personal rivalries and insecurities were at play in the lead up to the war.
It's amazing how Tuchman can bring those personalities to life. She doesn't just give you dry facts. She really gets into their heads.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that makes the book so compelling. You see how these individuals, with all their flaws and ambitions, they really shaped the course of history.
And on that note, what about King Edward? I mean, he had the nickname the Peacemaker, but his role in all of this is pretty complex, right?
Oh, for sure. He was no saint, that's for sure.
Yeah.
He was a shrewd diplomat, though. He recognized the threat of a rising Germany.
So what did he do?
He worked to strengthen ties with France and Russia, creating what would become the Triple Entente. It was a way to counterbalance Germany's growing power.
Smart move, strategically. But didn't that also isolate Germany even more?
Yeah, absolutely. It fueled Wilhelm's paranoia and probably made the situation even more unstable.
It's like a giant chess game, with each move increasing the tension.
And what's really interesting is that a lot of people at the time, they didn't think a major war was even possible.
Like them. Seriously. Why not?
Well, they thought the world was too interconnected, economically speaking. And they thought the horrors of modern warfare, well, they assumed nobody would want to go through that.
I guess that's kind of understandable, in a way. They had no idea what was coming.
Right. They were living in this bubble of optimism, oblivious to the forces that were about to shatter their world.
And that's what makes The Guns of August such a powerful book. It shows how, even in times of peace, the seeds of conflict can be planted.
It's a warning from the past that we should never forget.
Now, speaking of unexpected events, we have to talk about Belgium. It's this small, neutral country, right? But it becomes a major flashpoint that draws Great Britain into the war. How does that happen?
So remember the Schlieffen Plan, the German plan for a quick victory?
Yeah, the one that was supposed to avoid a long war.
Exactly. Well, that plan hinged on a rapid advance through Belgium to outflank the French.
So basically, Belgium was just in the way.
You could say that, but the Germans, they really miscalculated.
What do you mean?
They issued this ultimatum to Belgium demanding free passage for their troops, like they could just waltz through.
And what did Belgium say?
They refused, of course. King Albert of Belgium, he stood up to the Germans, and his defiance really rallied international support, especially in Britain.
Wow, that's a bold move, taking on Germany like that.
It was a huge gamble. The Belgian army was no match for the Germans, but their resistance, it bought valuable time for the Allies to prepare, and more importantly, it really swayed public opinion in Britain toward war.
I guess people were outraged that this small country was being bullied by a much larger power.
Exactly. And then you have the burning of the Louvain Library.
Oh yeah, that was a horrific incident. Tuchman really goes into detail about the destruction and the global outrage it caused.
It was a turning point for sure. It cemented the image of Germany as the aggressor in the eyes of the world.
And it helped push Britain over the edge toward declaring war.
Without a doubt.
So while all this is happening in the West, what's going on in the East? I mean, Russia is a huge player in this whole conflict.
Oh yeah, Russia is mobilizing this massive army. Tuchman calls it the Russian steamroller.
The steamroller. Sounds intimidating.
Right. But it turns out that steamroller was more like, well, a steamroller with a flat tire.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain that one.
They had sheer numbers, yes. But their logistics were a nightmare, their tactics were outdated, and their leadership was, well, questionable at best.
So much for being invincible.
Right. Their early offensives into East Prussia, they showed those cracks pretty quickly. They just couldn't sustain those advances.
And I remember reading about the Battle of Tannenberg, where the Germans, even though they were outnumbered, they just crushed the Russians.
Yeah, Tannenberg was a huge blow to Russia. It exposed all their weaknesses and really shattered the myth of their invincibility.
It also freed up German troops to be sent to the Western Front, right?
Exactly. Which made the situation in France even more dire.
Because at this point, the French army is in full retreat. Their Plan 17 has completely failed, and the Germans are basically marching towards Paris.
Tuchman does an amazing job of capturing the chaos and the desperation of that moment. The French were on the brink of collapse.
It must have felt like the end of the world.
It probably did. But there were still some bright spots, like the British Expeditionary Force. They fought bravely at the Battle of Mons.
They were outnumbered, but they held their ground for a while.
Yeah, they inflicted some heavy losses on the Germans and bought some valuable time for the French to try and regroup.
Heroic, but ultimately not enough to stop the German advance.
Nope. And it's interesting how Tuchman highlights the tension and the miscommunication between the Allied commanders at this point. Like, they weren't exactly a unified front.
That's never a good sign when you're facing a powerful enemy like Germany.
Right. And unfortunately, that lack of coordination would have serious consequences.
So we've got the Germans closing in on Paris. What happens next? I mean, is this the end for France?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. But we'll have to save that part of the story for after a short break. Stay tuned for more. The Germans, they thought they had it in the bag, a quick victory, just like they planned.
But the Battle of the Marne, that really threw a wrench in their plans.
Oh, absolutely. It was a turning point. It forced the Germans to dig in, and that's how trench warfare began.
And that, of course, became the defining feature of the First World War.
Yeah.
Years of brutal stalemate.
It's hard to even imagine what those soldiers went through.
Tuchman really captures the horror of it all.
She doesn't shy away from the grim details. But while all this is happening on land, there's a whole other war going on at sea.
Right, the British blockade of Germany, that was a huge part of the war effort.
Absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
The British, they were trying to cut off vital supplies to Germany, essentially strangle their war machine.
But it wasn't without controversy, right? I mean, they were interfering with neutral shipping, weren't they?
Oh yeah, it was a delicate balancing act. They had to be careful not to provoke other countries, especially the United States.
It's interesting how Tuchman highlights President Woodrow Wilson's struggle with neutrality. He wanted to keep America out of the war, but he was also deeply troubled by the blockade and the violation of neutral rights.
It was a tough position to be in, and you can see how torn he was. He tried to mediate, to find some kind of peaceful solution, but it was an impossible situation.
So you've got these huge battles on land, This struggle for control of the seas, and then this complex diplomatic game going on behind the scenes.
It really shows how interconnected the world already was, even back then.
And as the war grinds on, the casualties just keep mounting.
The human cost is almost too much to bear.
Yeah.
Tuchman describes these battles, and it's just heartbreaking, the sheer scale of the carnage.
And she doesn't just focus on the battles themselves, she also talks about the impact on civilians, the suffering on the home front.
It's a reminder that war touches every aspect of life. It's not just about soldiers fighting on a battlefield.
It changes everything.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of atrocities.
We touched on that earlier with the burning of the Louvain Library, but it goes much deeper than that.
Oh, yeah. Tuchman goes into detail about the German atrocities in Belgium. It was a systematic campaign of terror.
Towns like Visay and Dinant.
Civilians were massacred, homes destroyed, whole communities terrorized.
It's hard to believe that kind of brutality could happen.
The Germans tried to justify it as reprisals, but it was clearly a way to crush any resistance.
And it really backfired on them, didn't it? I mean, in terms of public opinion?
Oh, absolutely. It turned world opinion against Germany. People were horrified by what they were hearing.
So you have the actual fighting, and then you have this propaganda war going on at the same time.
Right. Each side trying to demonize the other.
It's amazing how Tuchman shows how all these different aspects of the war are connected. The fighting, the diplomacy, the propaganda, the home front.
It's all part of a complex web.
Speaking of which, we have to talk about the race to the sea. That was a pretty intense phase of the war.
Oh, yeah. Both sides were trying to outflank each other, desperately trying to find a way to break the stalemate.
It was essentially a race to the coast.
Right.
To see who could extend their lines the furthest.
And it led to some really fierce fighting. But in the end, it just resulted in the lines becoming even more entrenched.
It set the stage for years of trench warfare.
Exactly. And Tuchman, she really conveys the sense of futility of it all. The exhaustion of the troops, the constant threat of artillery fire, the feeling that they were just pawns in a game they couldn't control.
And the casualties were astronomical.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale of the losses.
And it wasn't just the soldiers who were suffering. The entire continent was feeling the effects of the war.
Food shortages, economic hardship, social upheaval. It was a time of tremendous change and uncertainty.
It's fascinating how Tuchman connects all these different threads, showing how the war was really fought on multiple fronts.
And what's so striking is how relevant those themes still are today. The dangers of nationalism, the fragility of peace, the impact of war on society.
It's like the Guns of August is a warning from the past, a reminder of what can happen when things go wrong.
And it's a call to action, to learn from those mistakes and work towards a better future.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we'll delve even deeper into the consequences of those early decisions and explore how the war ultimately played out.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it, the scale of the fighting once trench warfare really took hold.
Millions of men stuck in those muddy ditches.
Yeah, for years. It's almost impossible to grasp what it must have been like day after day living in those conditions.
Well, Tuchman, she doesn't sugarcoat anything.
No, she doesn't.
She describes the mud, the rats, the constant fear of artillery fire.
And snipers
Right.
just waiting to pick you off.
It sounds like absolute hell.
It was
a living nightmare.
And yet, even in that kind of environment, Tuchman finds these incredible stories of, human resilience.
Oh, yeah, I remember those parts.
Like soldiers finding moments of joy and camaraderie amidst all that suffering.
Singing songs, playing games,
Sharing what little food they had.
little glimmers of humanity in the darkness.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It is.
How the human spirit can endure even the most horrific circumstances.
It's a testament to our strength, I guess. But
Yeah.
as the war drags on, you can really sense this growing feeling of disillusionment.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The hope just starts to drain away.
Tuchman, she's so good at capturing that emotional toll of the war.
The sense that the world had just gone mad.
Yeah, and it's not just the soldiers who are suffering, of course.
No, the whole continent is feeling the impact of this war.
Tuchman talks about the food shortages.
The economic hardship, the social upheaval.
Women being forced into new roles, traditional gender norms being challenged.
A whole generation scarred by this conflict.
And she does this brilliant job of weaving all these different threads together.
Showing how the war was fought on so many levels, not just on the battlefield.
On the home front, in the halls of power, in the hearts and minds of ordinary people.
It's such a complex and layered story.
And yet, it all comes back to those early decisions, those mistakes that were made in August 1914.
It's a stark reminder of how fragile peace really is.
And how quickly things can spiral out of control.
The Guns of August, It's more than just a history book, isn't it?
It's a reflection on human nature, on the dangers of nationalism, on the consequences of unchecked ambition.
It's a warning from the past that we should all heed.
Absolutely.
So anyone listening who hasn't read this book, I urge you, go check it out.
It's a powerful, moving, and thought-provoking book.
You can find a link to purchase it through our affiliate link in the show notes.
It's an investment in understanding a pivotal moment in history.
A moment that continues to shape our world today.
And perhaps, armed with this knowledge, we can work to create a more peaceful future.
That's a great point.
A future where the guns of August never roar again.
Well said.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive into the guns of August.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning.